Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing simchat le'olam, kol ha'yeladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we bring joy to the world, if not to all the boys and girls, by talking about prophets like Jeremiah and about some of the best stories ever written.
I assume you're talking about Bible stories that are included in the Nevi'im section of the Tanakh.
Exactly, Rick. While the Haftorot are selected from the collection of biblical books that are collectively called prophets, some of these books are more in the category of biblical history and narrative. And this week's Haftarah is one of those. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very fine port today and talking Haftarah with my very good chaver, Rick Muller, our king of cannellation. What's new with you, Rick?
Well, I'm feeling kind of sad. We just came back from the funeral of our good friend Abe Berman.
Yes, we're all feeling sad. But at the same time, we all feel blessed to have known and learned from Abe. Abe was a big fan of Haftarah and of Nevi'im and Ketuvim in general. Until just about a year ago, Abe regularly read his bar mitzvah Haftarah, Va'era. It was always a great honor to hear Abe read this Haftarah.
Yeah, it was. He read the Haftorah until he was 100 years old. We both know there's an expression that appears very commonly in Haftorot that we've talked about before, and that was a favorite of Abe's. Ko Amar Adonai appears hundreds of times in Haftorah. You counted them, often with dramatic trope. Abe used to belt those words out as if he was trying to emphasize, "Thus said Adonai," which he should have. It's the first words of Va'era, his bar mitzvah parsha, and he grabbed you right away by singing it that way. There was 4 more in that Haftorah. Last week, we only had 1 in the Haftorah, and another one next week, but this week's Haftorah, there's no Ko Amar. It's absent, just like Abe.
Chasal, chasal, oy sidur, sidur Pesach, keil chasal, kechol mishpato, v'chukasal. Kasher zochinu lesader oso keniske la'asoso zoch shochen ahoy meyona komem kahal adas mimono bekorona hel nitechano pedoyim letzion berino leshono habo Lehishana habo b'Yerushalayim, la 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 la. Lehishana habo b'Yerushalayim.
Wow. Rick, I think we should dedicate this week's Haftarah Plethora to Abe's memory. We throw around the expression, may his memory be for a blessing. In Abe's case, it truly is a blessing. Baruch Dayan HaEmet.
Amen.
May we all learn from Abe, be inspired to learn and chant Haftarah into our old age, and have a life that is full of joy and happiness.
Amen.
All right, Rick, this week's Haftarah is from the first book of Kings and tells the story of the building of the temple under Solomon. The link between the Haftarah and the Parsha is clear. The Parshat T'rumah starts off with God's instruction to Moses to ask the people to bring a T'rumah, an offering or a gift for the building of the tabernacle, the precursor to the temple.
Right. And the Haftarah starts with Solomon imposing a levy on the people in order to build the temple.
But there's a huge difference between the two. Moses is instructed to accept gifts from every person whose heart so moves him, while Solomon imposes the levy or tax on all the people. And another difference is that Moses gets his instruction directly and explicitly from God, while Solomon is given wisdom by God and then decides to impose the levy.
True. God doesn't speak directly to Solomon in this part of the story, but what's your point?
My point is, there was something intimate and personal about the contributions toward the building of the Mishkan. The people donated items that they possessed: gold, silver, copper, colored yarns and skins of all kinds, including dolphin skins, wood, oil, spices, precious stones. They didn't just write out a check.
And they didn't expect to have their names inscribed on a plaque either.
Ouch. But a very good point. The phrase used in the Torah, in a Torah Parsha, is Asher Yidvenu Libo, which roughly translates as his heart may urge him. In contrast, in the Haftarah that we're going to read, we're told, V'ya'al HaMelech Shlomo Mas Mikol Yisrael, which our JPS and Alter both translate as King Solomon imposed forced labor on all of Israel, but which can also mean that he imposed a tax on everyone. No voluntarism here. By Solomon's time, the state had grown strong, and one result is that Solomon could coerce contributions. I think that this difference is one of the lessons that we are meant to take out of a comparison of the Parsha and the Haftarah.
Interesting comparison. Another contrast between the Parsha and the Haftarah is the description of the two holy sites. The Mishkan in the Parsha is basically a movable tent, but with a lot of accessories. The temple was a permanent structure.
Indeed, and the Haftarah is much more succinct in describing the construction than the Parsha. If you read the Haftarah in the Jewish Study Bible, you can even see a set of illustrations that help to visualize what the temple must have looked like.
Or you can go to any one of the large number of online sites, just look up King Solomon's temple.
I prefer to let my mind's eye describe it for me.
Is that it?
Let me just comment on two more points, and then we can get to the chanting. First, in verse 7 of chapter 6, we are told that whole stones were brought from the quarry so that no hammers or axes were heard in the house when it was built. I always thought that the prohibition against hewing the stones was to ensure that no weapons would be used in the construction. And now I have a different idea. They wanted the construction to be quiet. I'm reminded of the period when our shul was undergoing renovations, and our daily minyan was constantly interrupted by the loud sounds of construction. Nice to know that Solomon respected the tranquility of the local minyan.
Wonder if they had trouble getting a minyan in those days.
Ouch again. All right, my favorite verse is verse 9. And I'm just going to quote the English. When he finished building the house, he paneled the house with beams and planks of cedar. Makes me think of the temple as a warm and inviting den or library in a home, or kind of like the Flying Goose, the pub that I used to go to when I lived in Mozambique.
Okay, now I really know it's time to start chanting when you start to imagine the temple as your man cave or personal tavern, sir.
All right, okay, Rick. So let's divide the chanting into 4 sections. We start with the end of chapter 5, which focuses on the forced labor used in the quarries of Lebanon to hew the stone to build the temple. The first 6 verses of chapter 6 describe the basic architectural plans for the temple. In verses 7 through 10, that continues the building design. And then finally, the last 3 verses we'll read, 11 through 13, describe God's promise to Solomon to abide in the temple if Solomon keeps the mitzvot.
Okay, so let's start with the verses from chapter 5.
Okay.
What I see, of course, first is the pazer in verse 31. Hamelech, the second word there. Everything is about the king. he gets all the special trope, which he should. He was a wise guy. So Vayetzav Hamelech there in verse 31, he commanded, and then going back up to the top, the Darga Tavir, one of my favorite trope because of the high point and the low point. Darga Tavir is the trope. So again, on the words, the King Solomon in verse 27, Hamelech Shlomo, same thing. Verse 29, he gets the fancy trope, Vayehi Shlomo. And then again, down in verse 31, your hewn stones, the completed stones, Avanim Yikarot is there. And then the very next one is Bonei Shlomo. Okay, and it's translated as Solomon's masons, but we really know it means Solomon's builders, but it could be read as Solomon's children if you change the vowels a little bit and you make it B'nai instead of Bonai, which would argue against your point about the enforced labor.
That's a great point, Rick. And it kind of reminds me of the line in the paragraph that we sometimes read after En Eloheinu on Shabbat. It's from the Talmud, and it's attributed to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Chanina. But it's in reverse, because there it says, Al tikra benayich ele bonayich. Don't read your sons, but rather your builders. So similar point in the reverse order. But Rick, let's get rocking with the chanting. Get it? Rocking, stones.
Yeah, I get it. You don't have to hit me over the head with it. But let me recite the blessing first. Our viewers can follow the text on the screen or in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, starting on page 500. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
V'Adonai natan chokhma lishlomo kasher diber lo v'yehi shalom ben Hiram uven Shlomo vayichratu v'rit shnehem vaya'al hamelech Shlomo mas mikol Yisrael vayihi hamas 30,000 ish vayishlachem levanona aseret alafim b'chodesh chalifot chodesh yiyuv al-Levanon shnayim chodashim beveto va'adon Hiram al Hamas vayehi lishlomo 70,000 nosei sabal u'shmonim 1,000 Chotzev Bahar Levad Misarei Hanitzavim Lishlomo Asher Al Hamlacha 3,000 u'shlosh Harodim Bam Haosim Bamlacha Vayetzav Hamelech Vayasiu avanim grolot avanim yikarot liyased habayit avnei gazit vayivselu bonei Shlomo uvonei Hiram v'hagivlim vayachinu ha'etzim v'havanim livnot habayit.
Rick, that was great.
Thank you.
Anything special in the first 6 verses of chapter 6?
Okay, so again, the Pazer speaks to me first. It's the rarest trope on Shana in the middle of the first verse there. Shana, and it comes with the Arba Mayot in front of it. So the 400 years, that's an important signpost for the author, for the subject. 480 is what it actually comes to be with Shmonim Shana in front of it. 480 is a multiple of 12. There were 12 tribes. It's a cosmic kind of magical number.
Mm-hmm.
And then your favorite, Kadma V'Azla, on the word, same sentence, Bashana HaRevi'it, is telling us that the fourth year was a special year. Yes, that's when he dedicated the temple. And then there's another pazer later on in verse 6, the middle of verse 6, on the teeny little word ki. So what could be the importance of such a small word? The entire phrase is ki migraot natan labayit savich chutza levilti achos bekirot habayit. For he had provided recesses around the outside of the house so as not to penetrate the walls of the house. So here's my thought. I just saw YouTube on the archaeology of Jerusalem that the stalls of the shopkeepers were built into the wall on the outside where the pilgrims and the general people could buy their sacrifices. So it was a wise thing that Shlomo did. The merchants, the Levites, all the people could do their thing outside of the temple right there.
I like that. Lest you think that this feature of the design of the temple is frivolous, the trope tells us otherwise. Rick, time to chant verses 1 through 6 of chapter 6.
Vayihi bishmonim shana be'arba me'ot shana letzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim b'shana harevit bechodesh ziv hu hachodesh hasheni limloch Shlomo al Yisrael vayiven habayit ladonai vehabayit asher bana amelech Shlomo ladonai shishim ama orko vesrim rochbo ushloshim ama kumato V'ha'ulam al pnei heichal habayit esrim ama orko al pnei rochav habayit eser ba'ama rochbo al pnei habayit vaya'as labayit chalonei Shkufim atumim, vayiven akir habayit yatzia saviv, ekirot habayit saviv, lahechal veladvir, vayas slaot saviv, hayatzia hatachtona, chamesh, Bama rochbach, ve'atichona sheish bama rochbach, ve'hashlishit sheva bama rochbach, ki migraot natan labayit saviv chutza levilti Achos bekirot habayit.
Rick, I noticed something at the very beginning of that section. The first verse has 5 munachs in a row.
That's pretty rare, yeah. All leading up to the pazer.
Yeah, it's a long runway for a takeoff to a great pazer.
Yeah, well, it took a long time to get out of Egypt, I suppose. So
all right, I like that.
They're taking their time.
So what's interesting about verses 7 through 10?
Well, trope-wise, not much, but we do have an interesting concentration of the munach zakev katon on one word in verse 7, behibanoto. That always reminds me of the V'ahavta from the Torah, because the munach zakev katon is on the same word, you shall love. But here it's emphasizing a point that you made earlier, that during the actual building of the temple, only finished stones were used, meaning there was the process of quiet building that's being emphasized here.
So the minyan could daven in peace.
And quiet.
All right, Rick, time to chant verses 7 through 10.
Ve'habayit behibanoto even shlema masa nivna umakavot ve'hagarzen kol kli varzel lo nishma babayit behibanoto. 2 times that word. Petach hatzela hatichona el ketef habayit hayimanit uvlulim ya'alu al hatichona umin hatichona el hashlishim vayiven et habayit vayichalehu Vayispon et habayit gevim usderot ba'arazim vayiven et hayatzia al kol habayit chamesh amot komato vayechoz et habayit ba'atse arazim.
Rick, we're almost done. But now we take a turn away from the construction and to a more theological and fundamental message in the last 3 verses. Here, God does speak directly to Solomon. He doesn't focus on the quality of the craftsmanship or the ultimate beauty or functionality of the temple. Rather, God establishes a behavioral condition for Solomon. He tells them that if he telech bechukotai, walk by my statutes, ve'et mishpatai ta'aseh, and do my laws, and then finally, v'shamarta et kol mitzvotai lalechet bahem, keep my commandments to walk by them, then something will happen. I'm wondering if all of those are one thing or 3 separate things.
Can't help you there, but I don't want to forget your favorite Kadmavia's law, the beginning of verse 12, Habayit hazeh. But back to your question, it's a very common formulation.
So does this instruction then apply to Solomon alone or to the entire people? And why?
Another interesting question.
Okay, so let's look at the reward side of this deal. What does Solomon get out of it?
Before I answer that, I want to note the very first word of verse 13, which is on the next page. Yes, the last verse, V'shachanti. Again, the munach, Sakif Katon, is concentrated on one word. I think that's important. And V'shachanti here reminds me of Shochenad in our Shabbat Shacharit services. Here, God is saying that he will dwell in one place. But in Shochenad, Marom, we're saying that God inhabits eternity. Kind of 2 separate and opposing concepts. Now, what was your last question again?
Now, never mind. Since you won't answer my questions, I'll try to answer at least one of them. According to our Chumash, in a note on page 501, there are 3 separate rewards. 1, that God will fulfill his promise to David, whatever that promise was. 2, that God will dwell among the people Israel. And 3, that God will never forsake the people Israel. 3 conditions and 3 rewards. But it's very interesting that it seems that it's up to Solomon to fulfill the conditions, but the entire people reap the benefits. That's a lot of pressure on Solomon.
Hey, with great power comes great responsibility.
So true, Spider-Man. Rick, take us home.
Vayihi dvar Adonai el Shlomo lemor habayit hazeh asher ata voneh im telech bechukotai ved mishpatai ta'aseh v'shamarta et kol mitzvotai lalechet bahem Vakimoti et dvari itach asher dibarti el David avicha v'shachanti betoch bnei Yisrael velo e'ezov et ami Yisrael.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics and the editing that he does. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. We want to hear from you. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and family. We'll see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbos.